There is a moment, and I want you to think about it carefully, when you realize that the most exhausted person in any room is usually the most agreeable one. They answer every message. They stay late when asked. They absorb other people's problems like a sponge that was never designed to be wrung out. And they do all of this while quietly convincing themselves that this is what good people do. You probably know someone like that. Or maybe, if you are honest with yourself right now, you are starting to suspect that person is you. That suspicion is worth following, because what looks like generosity from the outside is often something far more complicated on the inside. And what feels like kindness in the moment is sometimes a survival strategy that has long outlived its usefulness. Let me tell you what is actually happening. Not the story you tell yourself about being helpful and supportive and available, the real mechanism underneath it. When you make yourself perpetually useful to everyone around you, you are not building goodwill. You are not accumulating social credit that will one day be repaid. You are training people. You are teaching them, through consistent behavioral repetition, exactly how much of you they are entitled to. And people, being the pattern recognition machines they are, learn that lesson very well. They learn it so well that the day you finally stop, the day you finally say no, or set a limit, or simply don't respond within minutes, they don't feel grateful for the years of access they had. They feel wronged. That is the trap, not the helping itself, but the expectation architecture you built around yourself without ever meaning to. Think about the last time you felt genuinely resentful of someone you were supposed to care about. Not angry, not hurt, specifically resentful. That low, grinding feeling of doing something you didn't want to do for someone who will never fully understand the cost. That resentment is information. It is your psychology telling you that a transaction is occurring that you never consciously agreed to. Somewhere along the way, an unspoken contract was established, and the terms were not favorable to you. And you signed it anyway because you didn't know how to say no without feeling like you were failing some essential test of character. Most people spend years in that feeling. They call it stress. They call it burnout. They call it being overwhelmed. What it actually is, underneath all those softer labels, is the accumulated weight of boundaries you never drew. Here is the brutal part. The people extracting the most from you are rarely the ones who appreciate you the most. In most social and professional environments, there is an inverse relationship between how much someone takes from you and how much they value what they take. This is not a cynical observation, it is a structural reality of how perceived value works. When something is always available, the mind does not register it as precious. It registers it as ambient. Like oxygen or Wi-Fi, you become part of the background infrastructure of someone else's life. Reliable and invisible. Noticed only when you fail to perform. The colleague who always asks you to review their work doesn't think of you as talented. They think of you as a resource. The friend who always vents to you for hours doesn't think of you as wise. They think of you as a drain. I am not saying they are malicious. I am saying they are human. And humans calibrate value based on scarcity, not quality. Now watch what happens when someone in that environment stops being available. Not dramatically, not with an announcement or a confrontation, just quietly begins to be less reachable, less automatic, less certain to say yes. The first thing that happens is confusion. The people around them experience a subtle disorientation because the expected pattern has been interrupted. Then comes something more interesting, recalibration. Suddenly the person who was ambient becomes visible. Their opinions carry more weight. Not because the opinions changed, but because they are no longer freely given. Their time feels more significant. Not because it became more valuable, but because it became less guaranteed. This is not manipulation. This is just how social valuation actually works. And if you refuse to understand it because it makes you uncomfortable, you will keep operating at a disadvantage inside systems that absolutely do understand it. I want to give you a specific picture of this so it isn't abstract. Imagine a workplace. There are two people at roughly the same level. The first one is responsive, collaborative, perpetually helpful. If you email them at 9 in the evening, they reply. If you need someone to cover a task that falls outside their job description, they say sure. If there is an awkward situation in a meeting, they smooth it over. They are, by every visible metric, an excellent colleague. The second person is competent but selective. They help when it matters and decline when it doesn't. They don't reply to evening emails until morning. They ask clarifying questions before agreeing to anything. When they say yes, it is clear and committed. When they say no, it is quiet but immovable. Now ask yourself, in most real organizational cultures, which of these two people is more likely to be promoted? Which one is more likely to be listened to in a meeting? Which one do people think of as a serious person? And which one, despite every genuine contribution, gets quietly overlooked when it counts? You already know the answer. You have seen it happen. You may have lived it. The first person, the always available one, has made themselves easy. And easy, in the language of power and perception, means low stakes. It means you don't have to try hard with them. You don't have to consider what they need or want. Because their needs and wants have never interrupted you. They have never made you feel the friction of their limits. And friction, strangely, is what creates respect. Not hostility. Not difficulty for its own sake, but the clear, consistent presence of a person who has a self that doesn't dissolve on contact with other people's expectations. That is what the second person communicates without ever saying it directly. I am here. I am engaged. And I have edges. Those edges are not walls. They are the shape of a person. And people with visible shapes, with defined contours, are far harder to dismiss than those who mold themselves to whatever the room requires. Listen carefully, because this is where most people get it wrong when they try to change this pattern. They think the solution is to become cold, to become withholding, to perform indifference as a kind of armor. That is not what I am describing. Coldness is just another form of reactivity. It is still your behavior being dictated by other people, just in the opposite direction. What I am describing is something quieter and more stable than that. It is the decision to stop organizing your behavior around other people's comfort and to start organizing it around your own values. Those are not the same thing, and the difference between them is everything. Someone who helps because they genuinely want to is operating from a completely different psychological position than someone who helps because they are afraid of what happens if they don't. The behavior might look identical from the outside. The internal experience is worlds apart. And over time, that internal difference produces entirely different outcomes. Because one comes from strength, and the other comes from a kind of low-grade, chronic fear that most people have simply normalized into their personality. You felt it, didn't you, that slight tightening when someone you know sends a request you don't want to fulfill? And the immediate, almost reflexive calculation that begins, can I say no? What will they think? Is this worth the friction? Maybe it's easier to just do it. That calculation is not consideration. It is conditioning. It is the result of years of small moments in which saying no felt more dangerous than saying yes, in which your own discomfort was treated as less important than someone else's convenience, until the habit of self-erasure became so smooth and automatic that you stopped recognizing it as a choice at all. But it is a choice. It was always a choice, and you can make a different one. 1144 p.m. There is a particular kind of social pressure that operates without ever announcing itself. And it is worth understanding precisely because it is designed to be invisible. It doesn't arrive as a demand. It arrives as an expectation. Soft and ambient. The kind of thing that exists in the slight pause before someone responds to your no. In the way a group chat goes quiet after you decline an invitation. In the micro-expression of surprise on someone's face when you don't immediately agree to something they assumed you would. These are not accidents. They are the social enforcement mechanisms of a system that benefits from your compliance. And they are so subtle, so woven into the texture of ordinary interaction, that most people never identify them as pressure at all. They just feel vaguely guilty. They feel like they have done something wrong. And that guilt, that formless discomfort, is exactly what keeps the pattern in place. Here is something I want you to understand about guilt. Real guilt, the kind that is useful and informative, is a signal that you have acted against your own values. It is the conscience doing its job. But the guilt most people feel when they enforce a boundary, when they say no, when they simply stop being endlessly available, is not that kind of guilt. It is a conditioned response, almost Pavlovian, triggered not by genuine wrongdoing but by the social discomfort of disappointing someone who expected more from you. The distinction matters enormously, because if you cannot tell the difference between the guilt of genuine harm and the guilt of simply having limits, you will spend your entire life apologizing for existing as a bounded, finite human being. And the people around you, consciously or not, will happily accept those apologies and file them away as confirmation that you were wrong to have limits in the first place. Now I want to talk about reputation, because this is where strategy becomes essential and sentiment becomes a liability. Your reputation is not what you think it is. It is not a reflection of your character as you understand it privately. Your intentions, your internal moral life, the effort you put into things when no one is watching. Your reputation is a social construct built entirely from the patterns other people have observed in your behavior over time. It is a story they tell about you based on evidence you provided. And here is the critical implication: you have been providing evidence constantly, whether you were aware of it or not. Every time you said yes when you meant no, you added a data point. Every time you absorbed an insult in silence, every time you laughed off something that diminished you, every time you made yourself smaller to keep the peace, you contributed to a narrative. And that narrative, compounded over months and years, is what people think of when they think of you, not the real you, the pattern you taught them to expect. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with. The idea that we have authored our own social diminishment, that the disrespect we sometimes experience is at least partially a product of the permissions we granted, is genuinely difficult to accept. It is much easier to frame it as other people's failure, their lack of appreciation, their selfishness, their inability to recognize value when they see it. And sometimes that is accurate. Sometimes people are simply users and you are better off without them. But sometimes, if you are honest, the dynamic you are trapped in is one that you helped construct. And that means you have more agency to change it than you have been willing to admit. That agency is both the most empowering and the most demanding realization available to you right now. Think about a situation you have probably encountered, or something close to it, a group of friends or colleagues, and one person in that group who is consistently talked over, whose suggestions are heard and then attributed to someone else 5 minutes later, whose concerns are treated as a slight overreaction, whose presence is pleasant but not quite taken seriously. From inside that experience, it feels like a mystery or an injustice, because this person is often genuinely intelligent and often genuinely trying. But from outside, it follows a logic. Somewhere early in that group's formation, this person established a pattern of absorbing rather than deflecting. They laughed at jokes made at their expense a few times too many. They backed down from a position when pushed, not because they were wrong, but because the discomfort of conflict felt unbearable. They were generous in ways that were slightly asymmetrical, giving slightly more than they received and never adjusting the balance. And the group read all of that information and wrote a story. The story said, this person won't push back. This person won't cost you anything. This person is safe to take from. Most people never notice this is happening until the story is already written and they are living inside it. Changing that story, once it is established, requires something that most people are deeply reluctant to do. It requires a period of being misunderstood. Because when you shift your behavior in an established social environment, people don't immediately revise their model of you. They experience the shift as a malfunction. They wonder what is wrong with you, whether you are upset about something, whether something has happened to make you difficult. Be careful here, because this phase is exactly where most people abandon the project. The social discomfort of the transition period, the slight tension, the confused or even irritated reactions from people who are accustomed to the old version of you, feels like evidence that the change was a mistake. It is not evidence of that. It is evidence that the change is real. Systems resist disruption. Social systems are no different. The discomfort you feel during a genuine behavioral shift is the pressure of the old pattern trying to reassert itself. And mistaking that pressure for a sign that you are wrong is how people spend decades trapped in dynamics they hate. Let me be specific about what a boundary actually is. Because the word has been used so often in certain kinds of self-help language that it has lost its precision. A boundary is not a wall. It is not a punishment. It is not a statement you make to someone about how they make you feel. A boundary is simply a point at which your behavior changes, not theirs. You cannot control what other people do. A genuine boundary says, if this continues, I will do this. If you call me after midnight, I won't answer. If this conversation becomes disrespectful, I will leave it. If this arrangement continues to be one-sided, I will stop participating in it. Notice that none of those statements require the other person to do anything differently. They are descriptions of your own future behavior, and they place the agency squarely where it belongs with you. This is also why boundaries, when they are real, require no enforcement through argument. You don't need someone to agree that your boundary is reasonable. You don't need to convince them. You just need to do what you said you would do, consistently, quietly, without drama or extended explanation. The drama, incidentally, is a trap of its own. When people first begin reclaiming social ground they have given away, there is a temptation to announce it, to explain the shift, to process it with the people being affected by it. And sometimes a single clear conversation is warranted and appropriate. But the extended explanation, the detailed justification of why you now need things to be different, is very often just another form of seeking approval. You are still asking permission, still orienting your behavior around whether the other person accepts your reasoning, still treating their understanding as a prerequisite for your action. It isn't. You don't owe anyone a detailed account of your internal evolution. You owe them clear, consistent behavior. What they do with that behavior is their work, not yours. Here is something that will sound paradoxical until you think about it carefully. The people who are most respected in any social environment, the ones whose opinions carry weight, whose company is genuinely sought rather than just conveniently used, are almost never the most accommodating people in the room. They are usually the most legible ones. Legible in the specific sense that you know where you stand with them. You know what they care about. You know what they will and won't accept. You know that when they say yes, it means yes, and when they say no, it means no. And that neither answer is about you, it is about them, their values, their priorities, their sense of what is worth their time and energy. That legibility is itself a form of respect extended to others, because it removes the guesswork. It stops the game of interpretation and inference, and it treats the people around you as capable of handling a clear, honest signal. Most people, deep down, find that kind of clarity deeply attractive, even when it is occasionally inconvenient. What people find quietly exhausting, even when they benefit from it, is the person who is infinitely pliable. You can never quite trust someone who never pushes back. You can never quite relax around someone who seems to have no needs of their own, because you are always waiting for the moment when the accumulated debt of their selflessness arrives to collect. And it does arrive. That is the part that rarely gets examined. The person who never said no, who absorbed and accommodated and adjusted without limit, who convinced themselves and everyone around them that they were simply easygoing, genuinely undemanding, happy to be helpful. That person has a breaking point. Everyone does. And when it comes, It comes with everything that was never said, every resentment that was swallowed, every no that was converted into a yes through sheer social anxiety. And it tends to arrive with a force that is entirely disproportionate to whatever immediate situation triggered it. The people around them are genuinely shocked, because nothing in the behavioral pattern they observed prepared them for this. And then something worse happens, because the outburst seems so disproportionate, so out of character. The narrative shifts. Suddenly the person who was never a problem becomes the difficult one, the one who overreacted, the one who changed. All the history that produced the explosion goes unexamined, because it was invisible, because it was never acknowledged, because the quiet accumulation of unspoken limits never registered as a cost until the moment it became impossible to ignore. That is what chronic overavailability eventually produces. Not gratitude, not recognition. A detonation that reframes everything that came before it in the least favorable light possible. So what do you do with all of this? Not the theory, not the framework, but the actual live situation you are in right now. The specific relationships and environments where the pattern I have been describing is actively running. The answer is not a technique. It is a reorientation, a fundamental shift in the question you are asking yourself before you respond to anything. The question most people ask, the one that has been running quietly in the background of every social interaction for years, is what do I need to do to make this comfortable for everyone? The question that produces a different life is simpler and much harder. What is actually true for me right now? Not what should be true, not what you wish were true. What is actually, honestly true about whether you want to do this thing, attend this event, take on this task, absorb this dynamic. That question, answered honestly and acted on consistently, is the entire practice. Everything else is commentary. I want to address something directly, because it will come up the moment you begin to take any of this seriously. People will tell you that you have changed. They will say it with a note of concern, sometimes with a note of accusation, as if change itself is evidence of a problem rather than evidence of development. And there will be a part of you that wants to reassure them, to explain that you are still the same person, still caring and engaged and available, just differently now. Resist that impulse, not because you should be unkind, but because the reassurance is a way of softening the shift until it disappears entirely. You have changed. That is the point. The version of you that said yes to everything was not the fullest version of you. It was a coping mechanism that had been running so long it started to look like a personality. What is emerging now is something more actual, and it will be uncomfortable for people who benefited from the previous arrangement. And their discomfort is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that something real is happening. Here is a scene I want you to hold in your mind. A person receives a message from someone in their social circle, a casual but slightly demanding message, the kind that assumes availability without asking for it. The old version of this person would have felt that familiar tightening, run the quick internal calculation, and replied within minutes with something accommodating. The new version reads the message, feels nothing in particular, sets the phone down, and replies 2 hours later with something brief and honest. Not rude, not elaborate, just true. The other person experiences a slight friction, a tiny interruption in the pattern they expected, and in that friction, something quietly recalibrates. It takes only a few of these moments, repeated consistently, for the social environment around a person to begin adjusting its expectations, not dramatically, not through confrontation, but through the accumulated weight of a pattern that simply no longer behaves the way it used to. This is how social repositioning actually works. Not through announcements or arguments, but through behavior that is different enough and consistent enough that the old story can no longer hold. Think carefully about the relationships in your life that feel the most draining, not the ones that are difficult because they involve real complexity and real stakes. Those are worth the effort. The ones that feel draining in a flat, textureless way, where you leave the interaction feeling slightly less than when you arrived, where you are always the one listening, always the one adjusting, always the one who somehow ends up managing the emotional temperature of the situation while the other person remains comfortable and unchanged. Those relationships have a particular signature. They exist because they were allowed to develop in one direction, and they have continued in that direction because nothing interrupted them. Interrupting them does not require a confrontation. It requires the simple, repeated act of no longer performing the role that maintains the imbalance. Stop being the one who follows up first. Stop being the one who resolves the silence. Stop explaining your absence or your unavailability. Just be less present in the specific ways that were always more about their comfort than yours. And watch what the relationship actually is underneath the dynamic you were maintaining. Sometimes you will discover there is a real connection there that was simply asymmetrical and can be rebalanced. Sometimes you will discover there was almost nothing there at all beyond the utility you were providing. And that discovery, while painful, is one of the most valuable pieces of information a person can have about their own social world. Lie. That is what the version of you that says this is selfish is doing. The version of you trained from early on to believe that having needs makes you a burden, that requiring anything from the people around you is an imposition, that the safest and most virtuous thing you can do is make yourself frictionless and accommodating and endlessly available. That version is not telling you the truth about virtue. It is telling you a story about safety. Because somewhere along the way, making yourself small felt safer than being fully present. Disappearing into usefulness felt safer than being seen and potentially found wanting. And that strategy worked. In the limited way that all fear-based strategies work, it reduced a certain kind of immediate risk while quietly generating a much larger and slower-moving cost. The cost of not knowing what you actually want. The cost of relationships built on a performance rather than a person. The cost of arriving at some future moment and realizing that the life you built was constructed almost entirely around other people's comfort and almost not at all around your own. Be careful with one particular mistake that people make when they first encounter this kind of thinking. They take it as permission to become indifferent, to rationalize self-absorption as self-respect, to mistake coldness for strength and withdrawal for wisdom. That is a misreading, and it produces people who are just as trapped as before, only now in the opposite direction. Real self-possession is not indifference. It is presence, full and grounded, that simply cannot be manipulated by social pressure. It is the capacity to be genuinely warm and genuinely firm at the same time. To care about people without being controlled by your need for their approval. To engage fully without losing the thread back to yourself. That combination, warmth without need, engagement without dissolution, is rare. And it is rare because it is genuinely difficult. It requires you to have done enough internal work that your behavior is no longer primarily a reaction to what other people might think of you. It requires that your self-regard be stable enough that a single disapproving look, a passive-aggressive message, a moment of social coldness from someone you care about, doesn't immediately destabilize your sense of whether you made the right call. That stability is not something you can decide to have. It is something you build, slowly, through the repeated practice of acting from your own center rather than from the orbit of other people's expectations. The brutal truth about social power is this: it does not belong to the loudest person in the room, or the most aggressive, or the one who takes up the most space. It belongs to the person who needs the least from the interaction. Not because they are empty or cold, but because they are genuinely sufficient unto themselves in a way that cannot be leveraged. You cannot control someone who doesn't need your approval. You cannot manipulate someone whose behavior is not organized around your reaction. You cannot extract from someone who has learned the difference between generosity and appeasement, and who has decided, quietly and without apology, to only practice the former. That person can be kind without being used. They can be close without being consumed. They can care deeply about someone and still say no, still walk away, still choose themselves when the situation requires it, without experiencing that choice as a betrayal of love or loyalty or goodness, because they understand, at a level that has moved beyond intellectual agreement into actual lived conviction, that you cannot give well from a position of depletion, that love offered from fear is not the same thing as love offered from fullness, and that the most genuinely useful thing you can ever be to the people who matter to you is a whole person rather than a service. This is what the boundary reset actually is. It is not a technique for managing difficult people. It is not a strategy for winning social games. It is the decision to stop constructing your identity around your utility to others and to start living from something more internal, more stable, more actually yours. It is the recognition that the approval you have been working so hard to maintain was never going to fill the space you were hoping it would fill. Because approval from others is always conditional, always shifting, always dependent on you, continuing to perform the version of yourself they found useful. The only thing that is not conditional is the relationship you have with your own judgment, your own values, your own sense of what matters. That relationship has been neglected. It deserves your attention now. Not eventually. Not when things settle down. Not after you have handled everyone else's situation. Now. Because every day you spend being endlessly useful to people who take your availability for granted is a day you did not spend building the life that is actually yours to build. I am not asking you to become someone who doesn't care. I am asking you to care accurately, to direct your finite energy and attention toward the things and people that are genuinely worth it, and to let go of the rest without guilt and without drama. I am asking you to notice the difference between a relationship that costs you and one that sustains you, and to stop treating that difference as irrelevant. I am asking you to take seriously the possibility that the most radical thing you can do, in a world that profits enormously from your compliance and your self-erasure, is to become someone who knows exactly who they are, what they value, and what they will not do, and who communicates all of that not through speeches or confrontations, but through the quiet, consistent, immovable fact of their behavior. That person is not easy to use. That person is not easy to dismiss. And that person, whatever else may be true of them, is finally, genuinely free.